The Orient Express, a train steeped in history and mystery, transporting people, cargo, and other things as well. On the Orient, North, by Ray Bradbury. Read by Karl. It was on the Orient Express, heading north from Venice to Paris to Calais, where the old woman noticed the ghastly passenger. He was a traveller, obviously dying of some dread disease. He occupied compartment 22 on the third car back, had his meals sent in, and only at twilight did he rouse to come sit in the dining car, surrounded by the false electric lights and the sound of crystal and women's laughter. He arrived this night, moving with a terrible slowness, to sit across the aisle from a woman of some years, her bosom like a fortress, her brow serene, her eyes with a kindness that had mellowed with time. There was a black medical bag at her side, and a thermometer tucked in her mannish lapel pocket. The ghostly man's paleness caused her left hand to curl up along the lapel to touch the thermometer. "Oh dear," whispered Miss Minerva Halliday. The maitre d' was passing. She touched his elbow and nodded across the aisle. "Pardon, where is that man going?" "Calais and London, madam, if God is willing." And he hurried off. Minerva Halliday, her appetite gone, stared across at the skeleton made of snow. The man on the cutlery laid for him seemed one. The knives, forks, and spoons jingled with a silvery cold sound. He listened, fascinated. It was the sound of his inner soul as the cutlery crept, touched, chimed, a tintabulation from another sphere. His hands lay in his lap like lonely pets. When the train swerved around a wrong curve, his body, mindless, swayed now this way, now that, toppling. At which moment the train took a greater curve and knocked the silverware, chittering. A woman at a far table, laughing, cried out, "I don't believe it!" To which a man with a louder laugh shouted, "Nor do I!" This coincidence caused, in the ghostly passenger, a terrible melting. The dying laughter had pierced his ears. He visibly shrank. His eyes hollowed, and one can almost imagine a cold vapor gasp from his mouth. Miss Minerva Halliday, shocked, leaned forward and put out one hand. She heard a sort of whisper, "I believe." The effect was instantaneous. The ghastly passenger sat up. Color returned to his white cheeks. His eyes glowed with a rebirth of fire. His head swiveled, and he stared across the aisle at this miraculous woman with words that cured. Blushing furiously, the old nurse with a great warm bosom caught hold, rose, and hurried off. Not 5 minutes later, Miss Minerva Halliday heard the maitre d' hurrying along the corridor, tapping on doors, whispering. As he passed her open door, he glanced at her. "Could it be that you are—" No, she guessed, not a doctor, but a registered nurse. "Is that old man in the dining car?" Yes, yes. Please, madame, this way." The ghastly man had been carried back to his own compartment. Reaching it, Miss Minerva Halliday peered within. And there the strange man lay strewn, his eyes wilted shut, his mouth a bloodless wound. The only life in him the joggle of his head as the train swerved. "My God," she thought, "he's dead." Out loud she said, "I'll call if I need you." The maitre d' went away. Miss Minerva Halliday quietly shut the sliding door and turned to examine the dead man, for surely he was dead. And yet... But at last she dared to reach out and touch the wrists in which so much ice water ran. She pulled back, as if her fingers had been burned by dry ice. Then she listened forward to whisper in the pale man's face. Listened very carefully. "Yes?" For answer, she thought she heard the coldest throb of a single heartbeat. She continued, "I didn't know how I guessed this. I know who you are and what you were sick of." The train curved. His head lolled as if his neck had been broken. "I'll tell you what you are dying from," she whispered. "You suffer a disease of people." His eye popped wide as if he had been shot through the heart. She said, "The people on this train are killing you. They are your affliction." Something like a mouse stirred behind the shut wound of the man's mouth. "Yes." Her grip tightened on his wrist, probing for some pulse. "You are from some Middle European country, yes? Somewhere where the nights are long and the wind blows, people listen? But now things have changed. You have just tried to escape my travel, but just then a party of young wine-filled tourists hustled along the outer corridor, firing off their laughter. The ghastly passenger withered. "How do you," he whispered, "know this?" "I am a special nurse with a special memory. I met someone like you when I was 6. "Saw?" the pale man exhaled. "In England. My uncle's house, 100 years old, full of rain and fog, and I was walking on the roof late at night, and sounds in the hall as if the storm had come in. Then at last this shadow entered my room. I sat on my bed, and the cold from his body made me cold. I remember and know it was no dream, for the shadow came to sit on my bed and whisper was much like you." Eyes shut, from the depths of his arctic soul, the old sick man mourned in response. "And who and what am I?" "You are not sick, and you are not dying. You are," the whistle on the Orient Express wailed a long way off. "A ghost," she said. "Yes!" he cried. Was the vast shout of need, recognition, assurance? He almost bolted upright. "Yes!" At which moment there appeared in the doorway a young priest, eager to perform. Eyes bright, lips moist, one hand clutching his crucifix. He stared at the collapsed figure of the ghastly passenger and cried, "May I? Last rites?" The ancient passenger opened one eye like the lid of a silver box. "From you?" "No." His eyes shifted to the nurse. "Her." "Sir!" cried the young priest. He stepped back, seized his crucifix as if it were a parachute ripcord, spun, and scurried off. Leaving the old nurse to sit examining her now even more strange patient, until at last he said, "How?" he gasped. "Can you nurse me?" "Why," she gave a small, self-deprecating laugh, "we must find a way." With yet another wail, the Orient Express encountered more mileages of night, fog, mist, and cut through it with a shriek. "You are going to Calais?" she said. "And beyond, to Dover, London, perhaps a castle outside Edinburgh, where it will be safe." "That's almost impossible." She might as well have shot him through the heart. No, wait, she cried. "Impossible without me. I will travel with you to Calais and across to Dover." "But you do not know me." "Oh, but I dreamed you as a child, long before I met someone like you, in the mist and rain." "Yes," said the ghastly passenger, "you are English, and the English believe. True, better than Americans, who doubt. French? Cynics. English is best. There's hardly an old London house that does not have its sad lady of mists crying before dawn." At which moment the compartment door, shaken by a long curve of track, sprang wide. An onslaught of poisonous talk, of delirious chatter, of what could only be irreligious laughter, poured in from the corridor. The ghastly passenger wilted. Springing to her feet, Minerva Halliday slammed the door and turned to look with the familiarity of a lifetime of sleep-tossed encounters at her traveling companion. "You now," she asked. "Who exactly are you?" The ghastly passenger, seeing in her face the face of a sad child he might have encountered long ago, now described his life. "I have lived in one place outside Vienna for 200 years. To survive, assaulted by atheists as well as true believers, I have hidden libraries in dust-filled stacks, there to dine on myths and mound-yard tales. I have taken midnight feasts of panic and terror from bolting horses, baying daws, catapulting tomcats, crumbs shaken from tomb lids. As the years passed, my compatriots of the unseen world vanished one by one, as castles tumbled, or lords rented out their haunted gardens to women's clubs or bed and breakfast entrepreneurs. Evicted, we ghastly wonders of the world have sunk in tar, bog, and fields of disbelief, doubt, scorn, or outright derision. With the populations and disbeliefs downing by the day, all my spectre friends have fled. I am the last, trying to train across Europe to some safe rain-drenched castle, keep where men are perfectly frightened by soot and smokes of wandering souls. England and Scotland for me." His voice faded into silence. "And your name?" she said at last. "I have no name," he whispered. "1,000 fogs have visited my family plot. 1,000 rains have drenched my tombstone. Its chisel marks were erased by mist and water and sun. My name has vanished with the flowers on the grass and the marble dust. He opened his eyes. Why are you doing this? He said. Helping me. And at last she smiled, for she heard the right answer fall from her lips. I have never in my life had a lark. Lark? My life was that of a stuffed owl. I was not a nun, yet never married. Treating an invalid mother and a half-blind father, I gave myself to hospitals, tombstones, beds, cries at night, and medicines that are not perfumed to passing men. So I am something of a ghost myself, yes? And now, tonight, 66 years on, I last found a new patient, miraculously different, fresh, absolutely new. Oh Lord, what a challenge. A race. I will pace you to face people off the train, to the crowds in Paris, then the trip to the sea, off the train, onto the ferry. It will indeed be a lark, cried the ghastly passenger. Spasms of laughter shook him. Larks? Yes, that is what we are. But, she said, in Paris, do they not eat larks even while they roast priests? He shut his eyes and whispered, Paris? Ah, yes. The train wailed. The night passed. And they arrived in Paris. Even as they arrived, the boy, no more than 6, ran fast and froze. He stared at the ghostly passenger, and the ghastly passenger shot back a remembrance of Antarctic ice floes. The boy gave a cry and fled. The old nurse flung the door wide to peer out. The boy was gibbering to his father far into the corridor. The father charged along the corridor, crying, What goes on here? Who has frightened my... The man stopped. Outside the door, he now fixed his gaze on this ghastly passenger on the slowing, braking Orient Express. He braked his own tongue. My son, he finished. The ghastly passenger looked at him quietly with fog-grey eyes. The Frenchman drew back, sucking his teeth in disbelief. Forgive me, he gasped. Regrets! And turned to run, shoved at his son. Troublemaker, get! Their door slammed. Paris! Echoed through the train. Hush and hurry, advised Minerva Halliday, as she bustles her ancient friend out on the platform, milling with bad tempers and misplaced luggage. I'm melting, cried the ghastly passenger. Not where I'm taking you. She displayed a picnic hamper and flung him forth to the miracle of a single remaining taxicab. And now they arrived under a stormy sky at the Père Lachaise cemetery. The great gates were swinging shut. The nurse waved a handful of francs. The gate froze. Inside, they wandered at peace among 10,000 monuments. So much cold marble was there, and so many hidden souls, that the old nurse felt a sudden dizziness, a pain in one wrist, and a swift coldness in the left side of her face. She shook her head, refusing this, and he walked on among the stones. Where do we picnic? He said. Anywhere, she said, but carefully, for this is a French cemetery, packed with cynics, armies of egotists who burn people for their faith 1 year, only to be burned for their faith the next. So pick, choose. They walked. The ghastly passenger nodded. This first stone, beneath it, nothing. Death's final, not a whisper of time. The second stone, a woman, a secret believer because she loved her husband and hoped to see him again in eternity. A murderous spirit here, the turning of a heart. Better. Now this third gravestone, a writer of thrillers for a French magazine. But he loved his nights, his fogs, his castles. The stone is a proper temperature, like an old wine. Here we shall sit, dear lady, as you decant the champagne and we wait to get back to the train. She offered a glass happily. Can you drink? One can try. He took it. One can only try. The ghastly passenger almost died as they left Paris. A group of intellectuals, fresh from seminars about Sartre's nausea, and hot air ballooning about Simone de Beauvoir, steamed through the corridors, leaving the air behind them boiled and empty. The pale passenger became paler. The second step beyond Paris, another invasion. A group of Germans surged aboard, loud in a disbelief of ancestral spirits, doubtful of politics, some even carrying books titled, Was God Ever Home? The ancient ghost sank deeper in his X-ray image bones. "Oh dear," cried Miss Minerva Halliday, and ran to her own compartment to plunge back and toss down a cascade of books. "Hamlet," she cried. "His father, yes. A Christmas Carol. 4 ghosts. Wuthering Heights. Kathy returned, yes, to haunt the snows. Ah, the turn of the snows. The turn of the screw. And Rebecca. Then, my favorite, the monkey's paw. Which?" But the orient ghost said not a marley word. His eyes were locked, his mouth sewn with icicles. "Wait," she cried, and opened the first book, where Hamlet stood on the castle wall and heard the ghost of his father moan, and so she said these words: "Mark me, my hour is almost come, when I to sulphurous and tormenting flames must render up myself." And then she read, "I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the earth." And again, "If thou didst ever thy dear father love, O God, revenge his foul and most unnatural murder." And yet again, "Murder most foul." And the train ran in the night. She spoke the last words of Hamlet's father's ghost. "Fare thee well at once. Adieu, adieu. Remember me." And she repeated, "Remember me." And the orient ghost quivered. She pretended not to notice, but seized a further book. Marley was dead to begin with. As the orient train thundered across the twilight bridge above an unseen stream, her hands flew like birds over the books. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." Then the phantom rickshaw glided from the mist and clopped off into the fog. And wasn't there the faintest echo of a horse's hooves behind within the orient ghost's mouth? "The beating, beating, beating under the floorboards of the old man's telltale heart," she cried softly. And there, like the leap of a frog, the first faint pulse of the orient ghost's heart in more than an hour. The Germans down the corridor fired off a cannon of disbelief, but she poured the medicine. The hound bayed out on the moor, and the echo of that bay, the most forlorn cry, came from her traveling companion's soul, wailed from his throat. And as the night grew on and the moon arose, and a woman in white crossed the landscape, as the old nurse said and told, and a bat that became a wolf, that became a lizard, scaled the wall on the ghastly passenger's brow. And at last the train was silent with sleeping, and this Miss Minerva Halliday let the last book drop with a thump of blood to the floor. "Rest in peace," whispered the orient traveller, eyes shut. "Yes," she smiled, nodding. "Rest in peace." And they slept. And at last they reached the sea. And there was mist, which became fog, which became scatters of rain, like a proper drench of tears from a seamless sky, which made the ghastly passenger ungum his mouth, and murmur thanks for the haunted sky, and the shore visited by phantoms of tide, as the train slid into the shed where the mob's exchange would be made, a full train becoming a full boat. The orient ghost who stood well back, the last figure in a now self-haunted train. "Wait," he cried softly, piteously. "That boat. There's no place on it to hide. And the customs." But the customs man took one look at the pale face snowed under the dark cap and earmuffs, and swiftly flagged the wintry soul onto the ferry. To be surrounded by dumb voices, ignorant elbows, lazy people shoving as the boat shuddered and moved, and the nurse saw her fragile icicle melt yet again. It was a mob of children shrieking by that made her say, "Quickly!" And she all but lifted and carried the wicker man in the wake of the boys and girls. "No," cried the old passenger. "The noise! It's special." A nurse hustled him to a door. "A medicine, here." The old man stared around. "Why," he murmured, this is the playroom." And she steered them in the midst of all the screaming running. "Children," she called, and the children froze. "Story time." They were about to run again when she added, "Ghost storytelling time." She pointed casually to the ghastly passenger, whose pale moss fingers grasped the scarf about his icy throat. "All fall down," said the nurse. The children plummeted with squeals to the floor. All brought the orient traveller like Indians around a teepee. They stared up along his body to where blizzards ran odd temperatures in his gaping mouth. He wavered. She quickly said, "You do believe in ghosts, yes?" "Oh, yes," was the shout. "Yes." It It was as if a ramrod had shut up his spine. The orator traveller stiffened. The most bristle of tiny flinty sparks fired his eyes. Winter roses budded in his cheeks, and the more the children leaned, the taller he grew, and the warmer his complexion. With one icicle finger he pointed at their faces. "I," he whispered, "I—" A pause. "Shall tell you a frightful tale about a real ghost." "Oh, yes!" cried the children. And as he began to talk, and as the fever of his tongue conjured fogs, lured mists, and invited rains, the children hugged and crowded close, a bed of charcoals upon which he happily baked. And as he talked, Nurse Halliday backed off near the door, saw what he saw across the haunted seas, the ghost cliffs, the chalk cliffs, the safe cliffs of Dover, and not so far beyond, waiting, the whispering towers, the murmuring castle deeps, where phantoms were as they had always been, with the still attics waiting. And staring, the old nurse felt her hand creep up her lapel towards her thermometer. She felt her own pulse. A brief darkness touched her eyes. And then one child said, "Who are you?" And gathering his gossamer shroud, the ghastly passenger wetted his imagination and replied. It was only the sound of the ferry landing whistles that cut short the long telling of midnight tales. And the parents poured in to seize their lost children, away from the orient gentleman with the ghastly eyes, whose gently raving mouths shivered their marrows as they whispered and whispered, until the ferry nudged the dock, and the last boy was dragged, protesting, away, leaving the old man and his nurse alone in the children's playroom, as the ferry stopped shuddering its delicious shudders, as if it had listened, heard, and deliriously enjoyed the long-before-dawn tales. At the gangplank, the orient traveller said, with a touch of briskness, "No, I need your help going down. Watch." And he strode down the plank. And even as the children had my tonic for his colour, height, and vocal cords, so the closer he came to England, pacing, the firmer his stride, when he actually touched the dock, small happy bursts of sound rippled from his thin lips, and the nurse behind him stopped frowning and let him run towards the train. And seeing him dash like a child before her, she could only stand, riven with delight and something more than delight. And he ran, and her heart ran with him, and suddenly knew a stab of amazing pain, and a lid of darkness struck her, and she swooned. Hurrying, the ghastly passenger did not notice the old nurse was not beside him or behind him, so eagerly did he go. At the train he gasped, "There!" safely grasping the compartment handle. Only then did he sense the loss and turned. Minerva Halliday was not there. And yet, an instant later, she arrived, looking paler than before, but with an incredibly radiant smile. She wavered and almost fell. This time it was he who reached out. "Dear lady," he said, "you have been so kind." "But," she said quietly, looking at him, waiting for him to truly see her, "I'm not leaving. You—" "I'm going with you," she said. "But your plans—" "have changed. Now I have nowhere else to go." She half turned to look over her shoulder. At the dock, a swiftly gathering crowd peered down at someone lying on the planks. Voices murmured and cried out. The word "doctor" was called several times. The ghastly passenger looked at Minerva Halliday. Then he looked at the crowd, and the object of the crowd's alarm lying on the dock. A medical thermometer lay broken under their feet. He looked back at Minerva Halliday, who still stared at the broken thermometer. "Oh, my dear kind lady," he said at last. "Come." She looked into his face. "Larks?" she said. He nodded and said, "Larks." And he helped her up into the train, which soon jolted and then dinned and whistled away along the tracks towards London and Edinburgh and moors and castles and dark nights and long years. "I wonder who she was," said the ghastly passenger, looking back at the crowd on the dock. "Oh, Lord," said the old nurse, "I never really knew." And the train was gone. It took a full 20 seconds for the tracks to stop trembling. The end.